Hello, my name is Ambient, and in today's video we're going to try and narrow down kind of the infinite amount of possibilities of what exactly Luffy's dream is and which one exactly is his real dream, or the realest dream, or the most real dream, or the newest dream. Luckily in the One Piece world, there are dream worlds within dream worlds within dream worlds. And this video is going to start off by touching on what exactly that real dream is and the multiple versions of it, and then we're going to get to the real kind of juicy stuff and the most important things that are hinted at in this chapter, which is not exactly what that dream is, but how exactly it's been corrupted and used to influence every single page of the manga, and by extension been used to control the entire One Piece world. And now that should sound very alarming, but please stick around for the rest of this video because we're going to be touching on tons of kind of crazy stuff I think that's been hidden in the One Piece world, including one of the meanings of the D initial, which I think is ultimately one of them being dream, but not the dream version that we know it. It's this DreaG or DreaG version of dream, which means specter or apparition, all kind of tying into that veil of illusion. And in just a few minutes I'm going to be touching directly on more of this kind of DreaG and stuff and that whole dream word, but that word itself means a meteor or falling star, as well as a will-o'-the-wisp. And you'll have to check out my Judas Kiss of One Piece video to kind of see what I think about a whole bundle of straw being used as fuel for a torch that might ultimately be part of the sacrifice that Luffy's kind of been planned for, which is the other part of this video we're going to be talking about. And before we leave this DreaG word, one of the definitions of it is portent, which kind of means to predict or to foresee, to prophesize. And I believe that in the One Piece world, dreams have been used to kind of control the future, and just like in A Song of Ice and Fire and stuff, dreams have been used to influence certain characters in the story to do certain things for other people. I'm going to be getting into some very real possibilities of what I think exactly the dream is, but no matter what the dream actually is in itself, what's most important about it is that it's getting Luffy to go on this adventure, and that can be a good thing and that can be a bad thing, and I think that in the One Piece world can be a thing that's been used against Luffy now and in previous generations. Because what's really peculiar about the word dream and our ideas of it is it's actually kind of a modern invention. The word dream as we use it did not used to exist in language, and its original kind of meanings all meant, either a specter or an apparition. In Dutch it was a bedrog, and it was deception or deceit, illusion, all sorts of things like that. The word dream was basically a word for illusions, like a dream world, a world of illusion type thing. Which, of course, if you've read the two prototype romance dawns of One Piece before the actual Chapter 1 of One Piece, the original Gum Gum fruit was actually from the illusion tree, which I will be touching on later in this video, when I talk more about that aspect of dream. And one of the points of my channel is kind of always playing around with words and looking at them backwards and forwards and all that stuff. And the first time we ever got this dream thing was in the Goa Kingdom. Well, Goa backwards, AOG, is officially the acronym for Act of God, or Assembly of Gods. So these three kind of mean here, and this not being everything on the surface that we think it is, but being a much bigger assembly, I think what might be manifesting itself here in this moment. And kind of along those same lines, Goa, the word itself, is actually a form of trance music that's mainly played in nightclubs. And we're going to be touching on trances and nightlife, nightclubs, all that stuff in this video. Please watch until the very end. You might start to actually be released from the trance and tricks that Oda has been playing on us this whole entire time. But I think it's kind of inarguable that in the One Piece world, people follow their dreams, and dreams almost kind of lay the foundation and create the road or the pathway that someone's life takes in the One Piece world. It can be because of inherited will, it can be because of bloodlines, genetics, fruits, whatever. Lots of things in the One Piece world kind of work to make someone go along a certain path, almost like it's written for them. And I think in a very real sense, we can kind of look at dreams as almost being kind of a carrot and the stick type situation for fooling an animal to make them run in circles and chase after the carrot on the stick, that type of situation. Now, what's really crazy about the carrot on the stick idea is that in this chapter, even though we're on the Thousand Sunny a whole bunch, we never actually see Nami's Macan trees anywhere, except for one panel. And when we use a little bit of light magic, that panel lines up to be right in the middle of Luffy's forehead with that familiar straw hat grin. But all of this, I think, is kind of pointing to maybe the idea that Luffy's dream has kind of been used as a carrot on a stick to lead him to doing certain things around the One Piece world for other individuals. And I think there's a lot to the idea, sadly, that Luffy's kind of being used to hunt maybe moon rabbits.
Well, here we are, Pismo Beach, and all the claims we can eat. What a way for a duck to travel, underground.
And I know that sounds crazy, but like, I've seen a lot of places that there's some ideas about Pluton being a mole, and there's lots of evidence to that, and I don't think that that is totally wrong. I believe there's lots of moles, and I believe there's lots of spies and people that, have things hidden and asleep inside them that are going to be awakened at a bad time that might kind of be considered a mole inside someone. But you don't need to look much further than Looney Tunes cartoons to see that if you really want to dig a hole around the world for a volcano to erupt through, you don't need to use a mole. You need to use a rabbit. And then this fishing idea, honestly, I think is kind of used very prominently looking through the light at the original time that Luffy set a dream page, which this whole page here, looking at, you can kind of pretty much see that it looks like Ace is kind of fishing Luffy's straw hat, and I think in a very real way, Luffy's straw hat has been used to make sure that Luffy does certain things. We know Luffy's dream, whatever he says in this chapter, is after he's become Pirate King. Well, we know something that in his mind he needs to do before becoming Pirate King is give that hat back to Shanks, and I think that that is ultimately kind of built into the plans for, Luffy's schedule, I guess. But schedule kind of sounds like such a bland word. I guess maybe I should say destiny. And now, don't get me wrong, as much as I love the idea, I don't ultimately think that Luffy is a moon rabbit. I think he might be a sea dog, or catfish that's been raised by wolves and thinks it's a dog. And I know that sounds crazy, and I'm not really going to talk about it much more in this video. I will be touching on some other sea dog type things and how the word sea dog used to mean shark. But that sea dog thing, as crazy as it is, those chapter covers for chapter 100 and chapter 1000, where Luffy's holding and he's eating the meat? And I know there's lots of ideas, including for myself, that there's lots to the idea that Luffy is eating things and he wants to eat something and that his treasure would be meat involved. Well, what's really interesting about that is in these covers, we really have to kind of look literally sometimes at the clues, and in all of them, these covers are supposed to signify what their true heart's desires are. And every single one of them, Luffy is holding the bone. And there are lots of clues like that that are just really dumb that we just don't see until we really look at it and hold it in our hands. And something that's said on every single volume of the English version of One Piece. On the back page of every single One Piece volume that's published, there's a block of text that's put there, and every single one of them in English says the same thing at the top, and they all, I'm going to read a portion of it here. After talking about Luffy eating the devil fruit and not being able to swim anymore, it mentions that he can now stretch like rubber. Its only drawback, he'll never be able to swim again. A serious handicap for an aspiring sea dog. Sea dog. Every single volume tells you that. It's also on the very first page. What's that pup up to, this guy says. And we're going to be touching way more on this dream crew right here that Shanks has assembled. But just for now, I think there's lots of stuff going on, and we're going to touch on later on exactly this kind of carrot and the stick and it being used to kind of bait and lure someone into a trap of destiny. And I don't want to really break any hearts here or anything like that, so I'm kind of going to give you a warning here that I do kind of believe that the idea that a old loyal dog is being used to bring back a stick or unknowingly kind of bringing back a treasure to a certain one place, like a hound dog type thing. I think maybe a really messed up truffle hunting, treasure jewel person hunting dog thing that in part is hungry for the biggest dreams. Later on in this video. First, we're going to touch on what is said in this actual dream. Now I want to stress before we get too much into the craziness that I think that there are multiple versions of this ultimate Luffy's dream thing. And we don't really have to look and get too crazy to kind of see some things kind of pointing to that. The very first time this thing happens in chapter 585, this flashback, Luffy's bandages appear on his face, they disappear when he says a dream, and then they reappear. I think there's lots of stuff and illusions going on, which we're going to touch on later on in this video. But I just want to stress that there's not one answer by design, but all of the answers work in conjunction with each other to make the story. And as absolutely crazy as it sounds, I think that the fact that we see a different reaction pretty much from every single member from the Straw Hat crew, I believe that's kind of all a clue to the idea that I think is extremely real and frightening, that every single person on the crew heard a different dream in this moment. I will talk about it directly later in this video, but the idea that Luffy is tied to the concept of granting wishes and dreams and true desires and all sorts of things like that, I think is what's going on in the story, and the idea that every single character actually sees what they truly want. Kind of like that mirror in Harry Potter that showed you like your true desires when you looked into it or whatever. But this object that may grant desires and wishes in a way obviously should kind of ring some bells going back to that DreaG word. The old word for dream, which meant apparition or specter, and all those meteor and falling stars, as well as fireball, which we also saw this chapter, which I have a whole video on that you can go check out after this video. But essentially a type of wishing star is what I think that Luffy may be empowered by, or the vessel of. Something kind of like that I think is at play here, but we will talk about that later on in the video, because that is just the furthest layer of what's going on in the entire story. But there is an actual literal dream that he says as well here for us that we will be looking at. This whole dream thing, starting like whatever 12, 13 years ago in chapter 500 whatever, has been kind of the question that has shaped my mind in the One Piece sphere of theories and stuff like that, and the truth of it, and discovering the kind of some of the things hidden behind it are what kind of made me start to really take seriously this channel and the idea of doing it. And the ideas and concepts were honestly just too big to start with, so I really wanted to get a bunch of videos and a couple months under my belt before we kind of start to go into it. And then perfect timing, this new chapter comes out, and boom. So here we are, and this video is going to be all about tackling what is Luffy's real dream and the truth behind who exactly has been using it to control the One Piece. And if the madness of that hasn't scared you off already, then this is a great time to ask you to please think about subscribing to the channel. We just hit 200 subscribers. I say we, but it's really just me. My wife helps out a little bit, but she doesn't really know the computers or anything like that. Really, neither do I. This is all a learning experience for me too. But I'm trying to get this whole rhythm down. I'm making videos and getting them out fast and all that stuff, and I'm shooting for a schedule of like 2 or 3 a week, and I'm trying to adhere to that. So if you're interested in weekly One Piece content and Berserk content, please think about subscribing and helping me out with the algorithm with a comment or something like that. I'd be very appreciative. Thank you so much. But before we go into kind of the magic of this whole moment, let's talk about some ideas of what this dream could be, taken literally. Now, I know a big idea that kind of floats around the community and has for a while is this idea from Arthur that it could be a huge party. And I don't super like the idea. I think that the aspect of it, of maybe a huge feast being involved, I think could be at play here, but it's a huge fart joke. And I guess we'll just go into that right now with what the first possible part of what Luffy is saying here could be, which is taking the world's biggest dump, and or flushing the world's largest toilet. Now, in Luffy's mind, the word great, can kind of be tied to Shanks and tied to niceness and warmness and feeling content or whatever and needed. And now, on the crazier end of this great word, in Middle English and Old English, great actually meant to be pregnant, to be with child, childbearing, all that stuff like that. And part of being pregnant is the idea that eventually you have, you give birth. So that being kind of tied into this great idea and being a great pirate, I think could be kind of a little bit at play here, especially with the idea that to kind of, have the greatest dump, you'd have to fill it with kind of the greatest ingredients. Essentially, in a way, getting pregnant with all the best foods to then make the best number two, kind of being a stupid poop baby. Now, a lot of these first couple ones we're going to go over are all kind of joke ideas. I think the same thing to like the the party idea and stuff like that. They're all kind of wacky joke ideas that only Monkey D. Luffy could do. Or only he could say, I guess. And sadly, I think a lot of that is because the truth of this whole thing is very, very, very messed up, and we're going to talk about that for the rest of this video. But these first couple ones are kind of happy ideas that are the first level of the dream world, so to speak. But coming back to this idea of the greatest dump idea, I think the idea that great can be used as a measurement of size could also be included in this, and you'd have to kind of eat the biggest food source or the most amount of food to then take that biggest dump weight-wise, in some funny joke Bugs Bunny cartoon logic formula. And in conjunction with that, flushing it down a toilet, I think could all kind of be tied to, if you want to look at all the evil of the world government in the world, and if that's all tied to Mary Joa and all this stuff, if Luffy is to crush it down into the ocean, that would be kind of figuratively and symbolically flushing a giant piece of shit down the world toilet. I didn't really think it was enough of a difference to warrant its own sort of category in this video, but I think all of those same reasonings could fit for a giant fart joke, and considering that the world government kind of rules the world with lies and stuff like that, controlling, pretty much blowing hot air in everyone's face. The idea of blowing that away and kind of smushing it down to be like a giant, blew away a fart, blew a huge fart, stuff like that, I think could kind of tie into the same idea. So having the giant, the biggest dump, having the loudest fart, all that stuff I think kind of could be at play on one level. And we're going to touch on this stuff much more at the end of this video, but ultimately I think that this whole One Piece setup is kind of a trap, and we know that Luffy and Goku and a lot of characters are kind of references to Sun Wukong. Well, one of the ways that Buddha fools Sun Wukong is by making him think he's climbed to the highest point of heaven, to the point where heaven touches the sky, and pees from it. Just like Tyrion from the wall in a Game of Thrones, all sorts of things like that. All being a reference to the Monkey King, Wukong, peeing from what he thinks is, the perch of heaven. Now, ultimately, he is actually still in Buddha's hand and pees into, the God hand and then is stuck in it. So all of that kind of being, if that process has been repeated in the One Piece world many, many times, I really wonder where all the seawater in the, story comes from, in a sense. And now, I don't think that anything that Oda does is one for one, but just the idea that some sort of devious monkey god Luffy thing, some moon key god, is constantly kind of being tricked and trapped and, in part kind of following foolish false dreams and that kind of being used by the gods for some purpose is what we're going to be touching on later on in this video. And I know what you're going to say. There's no way that that would be something that Gold D. Roger would say. And I agree with you. I think that there's no way what Roger said is the same thing that Luffy says. And I think it's a great big lie and illusion that I'll touch on later in this video, that they are the same thing. I have a video called The Pirate King is a Trap or a Lie, whatever. Kind of go in about how we've actually have two members of the Straw Hat Crews who have said things we've actually seen Roger say. We saw Usopp disband the Usopp Pirates, which is something Roger did. And we've seen Nami talk about circumnavigating the world in order to make a world map, but that idea of circumnavigating the world is the same exact thing Roger was talking about. So we've actually seen two members of the Straw Hats say things that Roger has said that aren't Luffy. And I believe it's fair to interpret Robin's dream of piecing together the true world history to be in line with Roger's idea of wanting to find out the truth about the world and all this stuff. So three characters that aren't Luffy have said things that Roger has said, at least. So let's entertain the idea for a bit that this dream that Roger had and the dream that Luffy has are not the same dream, and kind of unlock those chains that Oda's locked around our minds as a kind of trick that we can't venture into theory territory because it doesn't match up this way or whatever, because it's put in the story to kind of do that, and I will directly touch on that. And if we want to get technical, they do actually say the same thing, and it's not anything at all like you think. It has to do with and DNA. And I think in a sense ultimately being the lifeblood of a generation. But more on that later on in the video. Next up we have the possible dream number 2, which is to be a superstar or a superhero. This one I kind of think would be more meta commentary by Oda. It's to me obvious that he has a huge love for vintage superhero comics, American superhero comics. But in the 90s, in the late 90s, good luck trying to pitch a manga centered around superheroes. I'm sure it was hard enough just doing pirates, a theme of pirates. But Oda ultimately having a character who is in some sense a superhero, very much the same as Goku is like Superman. Now, they're all ultimately Kaguya references, which I'll get to in future videos, but this idea of a character basically being a superhero, which since the One Piece has been in publication, there has been superhero manga in the Shonen Jump. My Hero Academia, obviously, but others as well. Kind of that entire dam has been opened for manga in general of that kind of genre being introduced into the medium. The genre of superhero comics becoming superhero manga. Maybe not directly because of Oda's influence, but who's to say it's not? At least in part because of the American influence in One Piece that's present, kind of transcending to other mangas and fusing into them. But this superstar idea thing, really, when you look into the One Piece world, outside of cover stories, we only see stars in the One Piece sky once. And I believe that they are trapped and hidden in the One Piece world behind a veil and all these sorts of crazy things. And we know there's tons of star references, like with the supernovas and the rookies and all that stuff, whatever. But a superstar, a idol type thing, I think is at play here and could be what Luffy wants to be, and basically something that the whole world sees and acknowledges and feels in some way. And lots of times stars and meteors and shooting stars and stuff like that were heralds of, great change and revolution and stuff like that, and Luffy kind of bringing that in and being the herald of that change and having that be seen and felt around the world in the One Piece manga worldwide, but also in the story worldwide. I think could be a very real possibility, and directly related to this fact that there's no stars in the One Piece world. Any seaman worth their weight in salt just needs the North Star to be able to navigate. So anyone in the One Piece world not being able to navigate without a map means that there's no North Star in the world. And I think in a One Piece world direction sense, but also in the world of manga and quality of character sense, Oda has made Luffy the North Star to follow as a mangaka and as a fan for just, reading the story and watching great characters and stuff like that. But also as a actual mangaka and writer yourself, he's set the bar quite high of what you should strive for with a main character. All kind of being a North Star and a guiding light to guide, the future generations. Just like how the North Star guides you at sea. But I'll touch on that more when we get to the shared DNA dream stuff that Roger and Luffy have going on. And when it comes to stars, I think another aspect of this chapter, this whole emu erasing reality thing, I do think is a weapon that ultimately utilizes star energy in some form and weaponizes it kind of as a laser or maybe a moon or sun yo-yo type thing. More on that in my video coming up. But to keep going on this star kind of point or whatever, this be the superstar or sun of this universe. In this chapter, when we actually don't see the dream being said, we get a shot of the figurehead and mast of the Thousand Sunny, which is, a symbolic sun symbol, which is a star.
Okay. Duh.
And this star stuff kind of leads me to the last real big option that I think it is. And if I really was forced to pick one that I thought that it had to be, this is the one dream that I believe Luffy is saying here. For real, as a actual thing set in reality, before we get to how that is actually used in the story by all the major players in it. Looking at all the times that Luffy has said this, when he said this in the past to Ace and Sabo, and when he said it right here on the crew now, both of these ones, visually looking at them, we can see that at the bottom of the panel, there's grass. There's grass underneath Luffy each time. And the first time he says his trees, the first time he says his dream, there's these trees there in the background that aren't there when he's saying it. And on the Thousand Sunny, we went over earlier about how Nami's Makan tree is missing as kind of a stick and a carrot thing for Luffy's forehead. I said before that I think that there are many, many levels going on all at once. Pretty much every page of the One Piece manga, but especially when these dream things come up. And all of these grass clues and everything, I think are pointing us towards the clue turf. Now, in some of my other videos, I talk about how all of this might be a storybook missing its cover page, and one definition of the word turf is a fat book, a tome, a book containing many pages. It's a tally mark representing 5, and it's Pete for fuel, going back to the will-o'-the-wisp word we were talking about earlier with the drug word. And when it comes to sports in particular, turf means a racetrack for horses, and even more specifically than that, it can mean a hippodrome, which is a horse racing course, but also a fraudulent sporting contest with a predetermined winner, which, going into all I've said about the One Piece being a trap and how I think it is kind of set for Blackbeard to find it first, I think all that kind of ties into that. But how does this turf word tie into Luffy's dream here? Well, that's where it gets really interesting, because I think, looking at all the stuff when we meet Shanks and everything, whenever we meet him, he's always called the Chief. And the first chapter, the mayor is called the Chief and all these things. And I believe that Luffy here is saying that he wants to be the big kahuna. But that does not mean anything like what we think it means. And that's what the rest of this video is going to be about. Now, the first definition that we're going to touch on of the word kahuna is its second main definition, which is a great surfer. Now, on the surface, that kind of sounds stupid, but in my Pirate King Isn't Free video, I talk about the whole thing about how the freest man on the seas, who didn't want to control it and rule it, would technically just be someone who could swim in it freely. And I was mentioning how we saw the Thousand Sunny figurehead during the moment when Luffy's actually saying his real dream in this chapter. Well, what is the Thousand Sunny connected to? I mean, it is connected to a boat. A boat rides waves, etc., etc. I believe that's all a huge clue to that. This cover right here is also a huge clue to that, where we see, you know, all this stuff of Luffy kind of being tied to a surfboard away from what's actually riding the big wave and actually the King of the Worlds, which I think is a tie to what Luffy really is, which is a type of genie, and the main definition of kahuna is a priest or priestess of the traditional Hawaiian religion, but specifically a shaman or a wizard. And I think being tied to that surfboard clue is a big clue to the idea that in most depictions of genies, especially in Disney's Aladdin, the genie is tied to the lamp and is forced to grant wishes. And we're about to touch on exactly how Luffy kind of falls into that category, I think, in a little bit, but for right now, I think the idea that Luffy could be wanting to be the big kahuna, the ultimate chieftain, whatever, would be all kind of a subtle, you know, subconscious clue of wanting to overthrow Shanks and really be free in the world. And before we really get into that, that's kind of the main reason why I think we always are getting these weird kind of reactions to Luffy's dream. Because in these moments, the people listening to the dream and hearing Luffy say these things, I don't actually think they're hearing Luffy's dream. I think they're kind of hearing whatever their dream is. And maybe in some crazy sort of dream reality world, seeing their dream being accomplished by hearing Luffy's voice. Because whatever it is Luffy's saying here, to the people hearing it, ultimately I think what they hear is whatever version of them waking up is. Because sadly, I don't believe that what Luffy is currently is something that's like good for dreams, okay? We can look through all this stuff through the light and we can see that it really looks like there's some sort of a Dreamcatcher thing going on. And tying back into all the stuff with the turf and the ground and the grass petals behind Luffy and underneath him and all these things, I believe that there may be a wishing tree or a dream tree of some sort, and that pieces of that tree have been scattered about the whole One Piece world. And right now the world is using Luffy to kind of follow Luffy back to its source. And the word Kahu of Kahuna means garden or master, and guardian's main root word etymology wise is garden, to guard and garden. And I think in a very real sense right now in the One Piece world, Luffy's kind of gone from the dream guardian to the dream eater or dream catcher. And whenever someone is kind of viewing Luffy through the lens of him somehow being a means to an end of them accomplishing their dream, I believe it may kind of function in some sort of a magical process where whoever's kind of seeing this moment is actually seeing themselves accomplish their goal. And I think collectively that could be viewed as all of them seeing the moment that they wake up. In one sense, that's the story coming to an end, tying back into the whole book definition of turf and the, kind of closing the door and the pages on a huge story like One Piece, all the dreams coming true at the end, happy ending type thing or whatever. But I think more sinisterly, Luffy's kind of been used to hunt down the people in the One Piece world who all happen to have also the biggest dreams in the universe. Every member of the Straw Hats crew seems to have some sort of an impossible world-altering dream, and I believe that that is by design from someone, probably Shanks, to kind of have a dream crew whose dream power can be used to shape the One Piece world. Basically making the Straw Hat crew a sort of pseudo group of Dragon Balls. And we all know the common shonen trope of friendship is power and the true friends are the real treasure, and we do actually even see that before the time skip, that Luffy's real treasure is his friends, the Straw Hat crew. And in the SBSs, Oda always refers to the Straw Hat crew as the Straw Hats, and I think he kind of groups them all together, kind of like how you would group together the Dragon Balls by, verbally. I think he thinks of them as a collective, and kind of if they're all kind of part of this crazy Yggdrasil wishing tree thing, well, riding the biggest wave, tying back into the Kahuna word, wave means, can mean to travel and to leave a place. So one part of the tree, one Dragon Ball specifically wanting to leave the group and go on adventures, sounds a lot like Luffy's role in the crew anyway. And I think that this process has maybe been done in the One Piece world multiple times to kind of keep the whole world idle and in a resting phase or a resting place. But that resting place idea is very peculiar, and I want to draw your attention to where exactly Luffy is resting his hands and then his head, because I think that that is a major key to this idea that ultimately Luffy is trying to wake up and be free from a nightmare, is because in this panel, even though he's laying on the ground and all this stuff, Luffy is resting his head in his hands between the Straw Hat and the ground. He is separating the Straw Hat from his person, literally, in this image. And before we get into the real good crazy stuff, that leads me to the last kind of option that I think's going on here, is that the dream is not actually a real dream and it's all illusion, and that each Straw Hat pirate either heard or didn't hear, reality or non-reality here. Because I do believe that ultimately it's a non-existent dream. It's just to keep the story alive, to keep the mystery going. And him symbolically and literally kind of having his eyes closed and being asleep here is huge. But where the dream is talking about coming from is the inside of the hat. The first chapter back from this hiatus a month or two ago, we saw this shot of the Straw Hat kind of going over the sun, looking very, very like an eclipse. Well, what's really interesting is there's another real eclipse with the moon shown in that too, and it's from the inside of the hat where like your actual head goes into. And in this chapter, look at where the bubbles are coming from when this dream is ended. At the end of my dream points right into this space inside Luffy's hat, which is a spot inside the hat that we almost never see. It is almost never shown as drawn in manga panels, this inside darkness part of the hat. And when we look through the light at the panel with a little bit of magic, we actually see that Robin's eye from the page behind it lines up exactly inside of that hat. And I do believe that that's all a hint to the dreams and direction of dreams being corrupted to force an eclipse. And if you've read Berserk, I do absolutely fucking mean that type of eclipse. And I believe in the One Piece world, there's a dream eater that has basically caught dreams and directs and lures dreams, and kind of using whatever magical means and gravitational pull of the One Piece universe guides dreamers to dreams that force an eclipse-like situation to happen. And it's essentially a conveyor belt into the mouth of the big bad wolf from every fairy tale. And I got a video coming out in October and Halloween that's gonna blow your fucking mind about Robin and O'Hara and maybe some ties to Berserk and the idea of evil and just some crazy, crazy shit.
Are you believing the mainstream media these days, Charlie? Because...
Oh, no. Okay. I get all my information from my own subconscious.
Fair.
But I do believe that since this straw hat was given to Luffy by Shanks, and Shanks meeting him back in the story again at the end and giving him back this hat is kind of a thing that Luffy has to do before becoming Pirate King, and then before becoming whatever this other added-on dream is. It's kind of hijacked his dreams and directed it, at least it has to go through that kind of toll booth before he gets to his real dream that he's saying here. And I do believe that all that is hinted at in this Eclipse Eye thing here. And I will explain that, I promise, in more videos. And I'll go as far as to say there's actual proof. But I don't want to, lose you and sound too crazy.
What are you gonna do?
I'm going to call the police.
No, you don't need to do anything. Because... God is bigger than the boogeyman.
But in One Piece, we actually have had confirmed boogeymen. And we know that in some form, the idea of boogeymen exists. And boogeymen and nightmare creators and dream catchers, I think, are on full display here. Because looking through the page still again with the magic, we see Luffy laying down to kind of close his eyes and dream whatever like that. And then in the sky, he's getting caught in the sails of the ship and the rails of the ship. And the tackle lines or whatever of the ship, I think all kind of being an indicator that there's a dream catcher at play, and this dream catcher wants to eat the biggest dream. And I think Luffy might be in some form an embodiment of that kind of dream hunger, very akin to Sandman stuff. Shout out to Dire Regulus, my friend's channel. Go check him out. But he's kind of talked about some ties to Sandman. I'll have some videos coming out about that and kind of the 7 endless dream states and stuff like that. But this Dream Eater thing and Boogeyman thing is hinted at not only by Bonnie at the end of this chapter, the Big Eater Bonnie, but also this idea that there's lots of old myths with a World Eater or a Sun Eater, and this person that by eating the sun, you would essentially steal the ability to dream from the entire One Piece world. And I think that someone has kind of directed Luffy on that route for sinister purposes. And like always, I think the clues are kind of visually there every single time. And in both panels, going back to this grass idea. Grass needs to see the sun and get sunlight to grow. Luffy blocking it. He's standing on it here. He's laying on it here. He is forcibly stopping that action and that growth from happening. It's as if the Straw Hat has been a cap on not only Luffy's dreams, but because of the actions that Luffy has to take to get rid of it, it's almost kind of been a cap on the rest of the crew's dreams as well. And since we've really kind of seen no actual historical figures wearing the Straw Hat, despite, lots of ideas around the community and stuff like that, the idea that this hat, the straw hat, is a cup or a tone dial for nightmares and catching failed dreams, and these hats that have been forgotten to history because ultimately the person that was wearing them failed at achieving their dream, and that this hat has in a very Eclipse type battery thing been charging up and like a tone dial absorbing failed dreams, which are dreams that have become nightmares. And I think the nightmare word has all sorts of funny stuff that Oda's doing, and I talk about it in my Vegapunk video. But remember, not only was Sun Wukong in heaven the god of the stables and taking care of horses, but also one of Neptune's often forgotten godly duties was being the god over horses. And I think, sadly, in a very real way, Luffy is kind of the shepherd of lost children and lost horses and kind of the ultimate catcher of nightmares. And in a world much like ours where horsepower is a determining factor in energy production, I think nightmare fuel plays a role in the One Piece world. And trauma specifically. Historical, family, bloodline, all that stuff. Trauma in all of its forms and the impact that it has on children especially, but adults, the entire world, I think has been utilized in the One Piece world to control it and dictate power over it. Or at least over this level of hell. Because, yeah, That's true. I think the whole One Piece world right now is in the underworld in some form. And you could say kind of figuratively that's because they're underneath the heavens and Mary Joa and the Red Line, all that stuff. Tying into that whole idea that I think there's no stars in the One Piece world, I think that the whole One Piece world might be underneath the crust of the actual world. And as we saw inside Laboon, clouds can be replicated pretty easily in the One Piece scenery, but stars and their movement and placements, those must not be as easy to paint on or something. But another clue to me that kind of shows this dream corruption and abrupt entering into the One Piece story world thing is still Jewelry Bonnie and that name Jewelry Bonnie, and remembering that in the official translation it's not the treasure tree Adam, it's the jewel tree Adam. So this idea that the Thousand Sunny, which is the thing that's shown while Luffy is actually saying his dream in this chapter, that ship, which Frankie literally states that he wants it to be a ship of dreams. And there's lots of stuff going on with Dr. Frankenfurter. I mean Frankie, that I will have a big video coming out in October. That's going to be really fun, and I think you guys will really enjoy it. I got some costumes coming. My wife and I are really working on some funny stuff for that video, because it's got to be funny because it's so fucked up.
I'm here with nothing to worry about.
I see you shiver with anticipation.
But back to this idea that there are corruptors and dream eaters and nightmare pollutants working their magic, and I guess you could say almost being a tea brewing in the One Piece world that is clouding the purity of the story in a very real way, is happening in this chapter, and it's kind of been hinted at, but it happens all the time, and I think it's kind of a thing that Oda struggles with, but it's something that every single writer kind of struggles with. And before I get into that, I just kind of want to say, I know a lot of people on YouTube kind of critique stories and review things and stuff like that, and then they've never actually written a story in their whole entire life. Now, I do not believe that you actually need to be able to write or curate a story to be able to critique it and review it. I do not believe that that's a necessary requirement. But I will say that the ability to do both is something that is special, and I think I maybe can offer that on this channel. And I don't really want to go too much crazy into it, but I have my own series called The Shonen Beat that you can read for yourself for free on my Patreon, and kind of judge for yourself if I can write or not. And I believe it's the best American manga ever made. And that might not be a huge category, but it is something that I think my series has attained, and you can tell me if you think so or not in the comments or on the Patreon, whatever. But I do believe over the last 15 years of studying manga and trying to create my own manga world and trying to do kind of my own special thing, it has kind of opened up my eyes to see a lot of the techniques and things that every single manga artist ever has been doing. And I hold the title of mangaka in very high esteem. I believe that they are modern Renaissance men. Not only do you have to be able to draw, but you must be able to write and create characters and all sorts of things like that. But enough about all that stuff. If you'd like to check it out, I'll leave a link in the description. It's called The Shonen Beat. But anyone who's kind of dabbled in writing and has gotten kind of good at it obviously makes the story themselves. But if you've done a good job in creating characters, the characters will start to play a role in where the story goes and how it flows and functions. Everything kind of works in conjunction like a giant solar system of motivation and reason and plot progression and character development and world building, and everything has to work together. But at a certain point, once you've made a character, you can't just make them do anything. It has to ultimately be in character for that particular character, if that makes sense. And Oda has kind of taken that to the next level to not only be in his main characters, but to be in the villains and background itself. And in those very things, there is a corruption that has been at work since the very beginning and has kind of corrupted the main character of the series, forcing Oda to draw a story that he might not be fully in control of in some aspects. And while that sounds crazy, what I mean, the way I think that Oda's kind of playing with it on a meta level is that any writer ever is influenced by their favorite writers. So if you're drawing a manga and one of your favorite authors ever is Kentaro Miura, you're going to be influenced by aspects of the story of Berserk, whether you mean for it to be or not. And I think that the same thing happens with Akira Toriyama from Dragon Ball Z, the same thing happens with George R.R. Martin, the same thing happens with J.R.R. Tolkien. Every great author in Oda's world and every single series he's loved kind of shows itself up somewhere in the One Piece story, whether Oda's conscious of it or not. And I'm just going to rip off the illusionary band-aid that keeps popping off of Luffy's face and Sabo's face and all this stuff in the flashback and the current chapter. But Sabo is Elmer Fudd, and you can see through here him and Ace fishing Luffy's straw hat, and I think this is all kind of a clue into this corrupting dreams thing in the past. Most importantly, Sabo is Elmer Fudd hunting magical moon rabbits that grant wishes. Because that black magic hat that he wears all the time, that needs to be put on Frosty the Snowman, is hungry for magical rabbits from the moon. But now let's get to some juicy stuff, like how Luffy is trying to shoot the moon. Okay, now the famous 1st century Greek essayist Plutarch considered the moon a way station for the coming and going of souls, essentially a bridge to the afterlife. And in the past, it was believed that lunar eclipses were instances of the moon being eaten up, and they had a ton of different rituals that they would enact to bring the moon back. And that included like just rituals they would do for the regular monthly phases of the moon as well. And the expression shooting the moon, which now is a term of someone with great ambition, was an attempt to rekindle the light of the moon with fiery arrows, which I talked about in my Lunarian video a little bit, how I think there are parties in the One Piece world who are trying to bring back a society that was more moon-based or more moon ritual and worship-based, very similar to pagan gods and their ties to the moon. And I think that that's one of the fantastical versions of what Luffy wants to do, is kiss the moon or catch the moon in some sense like it's a giant fish, but ultimately touch it and bring it to Earth to have them kind of combine and join as one in some way, whether that's to be used to destroy Mary Joa like a giant golden ball like in Skypiea, or it's something much more fantastical, this idea that he is working from the ground trying to grow like a giant tree to touch and grab the moon and catch it, I think is a valid interpretation of what might be going on in some sense. All kind of ultimately tying back into the idea maybe that the moon controls the night and the nighttime is the dream time and dream realm, and controlling the moon would in some aspect and way control dreams and stuff like that, I think could be part of all of this stuff. On a joke level, the idea that the moon is made out of cheese, and if he was trying to have the greatest dump, he would need the greatest food, and maybe this cheese is so good it's considered the best cheese and the gold of the world. Eating it would be an ingredient of that giant dump. I think it would work for that. And I know that giant poop and dump idea is very, very silly, and the idea that it could be tied to the moon is even sillier, but I know there's lots of ideas that maybe Trafalgar Law is actually tied to maybe this moon god thing, and the op fruit, op is an anagram for poop. And I do actually wonder if in the same way that the intestines and stomach and the food that's put into it kind of grow and control a human body, if that might be something in the deepest layers of the op fruit's history, that it was designed like a stomach. If there is something tied to this return to the old ways and a kind of leaning towards old pagan rituals and the moon, maybe touching the moon and bringing it back to Earth would in some way symbolically be showing this return to the moon civilization. And if these people left the world with a promise to eventually come back, this could be that fulfillment of those moon people coming back to the Earth. And then I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities that Oda could be playing with the idea that the moon was once a part of the Earth and over time got blown off and hit by asteroids to kind of chunk off into its own thing. And this return to one piece and one overall being could be something he's kind of playing with here. And when we first, of course, heard about Luffy's overall dream and all this stuff back in around 585 and stuff before the time skip, Great Terminal was kind of known as the world's dumping pot and was the place where all the world's trash seemed to gather. That was what was said and all that stuff like that. Now, this shot we see here is very interesting, where we actually don't see Luffy's head and it's all the straw hat only, and I do believe that there's something to the idea that this tree branch is trying to get back to itself somewhere. But ultimately just this idea that everything that is left and then becomes trash at some point comes back again, all funneling through maybe this place and this wishing well, which is where Luffy might be, from in some sense. All this kind of tying into either that whole giant poop idea or flushing down the giant toilet, thing. And I really don't mean to make my channel and my takes so abrasive or contrarian or anything like that. I just have a lot of differing opinions of a lot of things going on with the story, and I've always sort of had a big problem with this idea that Luffy would destroy the Red Line. Imagine the global world flooding that would happen if he destroyed something like the Red Line. I think there's lots of people worried about Emu flooding the Red Line, and this chapter might have hinted more at her powers not being so water-based. But if you were to crush and destroy and displace a gigantic landmass like the Red Line, that would essentially flood the entire world. So that could be one form of this kind of dream eater that crushes and destroys dreams and kind of floods them and snuffs them out without ever knowing it, thinking they're doing something good, and ultimately this turns into something terrible. I believe that's kind of the whole purpose and MO of this Dreamcatcher thing. And obviously causing a cataclysmic event which makes massive flooding around the world happen, that would ultimately be a giant, flushing of a toilet to a certain point of view, like Obi-Wan always says. And in contrast, also tying into this big Kahuna idea and riding the tallest and biggest wave. If there was a global catastrophe that caused worldwide flooding and you wanted to survive that as a civilization, the wish of the people would be to ride that wave in a way, all kind of tying into this big Kahuna and riding the biggest wave, while also simultaneously granting, everyone their's wishes to continue living. I believe that actually, now something you may have noticed about all of these dreams that Luffy could have possibly had is that they all kind of revolve around including other people and in a sense kind of including their dreams. Kind of whatever he's trying to do sort of encompasses their goal as well. Look no further than Zoro. Of course, the Pirate King's first mate would be, the strongest swordsman. Of course, the Pirate King gonna go around the world, find the best treasures, gonna have the best navigator and map maker, etc., etc. Best ship, best cook, all of it makes sense to me. Well, all that, like I said before about how each person seeing Luffy might be seeing their dreams accomplished in some way, I think kind of ties into the idea that Luffy is a sort of dream eater. And one version of that is a wishing well. And for that to make sense, I'm gonna have to go into what Luffy is in a sense, in part, which is a wishing well. And in particularly, a wishing well that a meteor crashed into. Or, let's get more fantastical. A wishing well that a wishing star landed in, or chose to be its bed. Now, I know that can sound really crazy at first, but let me ask you a big question. Have you ever wondered how Luffy has such an expansive lexicon of weaponry terms? For being maybe one of the, on paper, stupidest characters in all of manga, how on earth does Luffy have such a vast knowledge of weaponry? Well, I think it's because one of the original purposes of wishing wells was a place where people put the used weapons from a battle in. It was basically a weapon depository. After wars and strife and all that stuff had plagued the nation, they would throw all the old and broken weapons into a wishing well. And that actually served a bunch of purposes. The metal from the weapons, and this is actually the same thing that happens from pennies. Now, that's another thing that we're going to get into about Luffy being kind of a sort of copper penny. But this idea that all of the metal in the well would actually clean the town's water. The metal itself would filter out the water and actually clean it, so it was drinkable for the citizens. It was almost a perfect example of this kind of war, creating destruction and people dying and all these bad things, but from that, having something birth like clean water somehow, it is actually a real thing and was actually the real purpose of quote-unquote wishing wells to start. And I talk about it in my Emu Has Uranus video, but in that one I talk about how the Straw Hat in Mary Joa is actually a grave site and a grave marker, designating a sacred place in the One Piece world, probably where most likely Joy Boy died, or the original one, or one of them. But the idea that that is also this kind of what a wishing well was in part, which was a grave marker and a place of worship for sometimes for people that didn't have enough for graves and stuff, they could go there and kind of honor the dead in their own way at the wishing well. That being a start of a cleaning process for a town, to clean its water, I think on a grand scale in the One Piece world it's actually happening too. And from this atop the world, this wishing well gets started, and that cleansing process and cleansing out the evil and badness in the One Piece world has started. Now, I think a lot of characters in the One Piece world have taken advantage of that, but that process being there, I do think is at play. This wishing well, in a very literal sense, cleaning up the world, but then also in a magical sense, kind of granting wishes and saving people. But all may be kind of stemming from this dying wish to make the world a better place. But let's get into the real crazy stuff, because I want to talk about Dragon Ball. And to do that, we're going to have to thread the needle of time through all of these chapters that have talked about this magical hidden wish or dream that Luffy has, because it's really crazy. You're gonna love it. The very first time that Luffy mentions this whole what his dream is and it's hidden from us is in chapter 585. 585 came out on May 24th, 2010. Now, May 24th is actually Carrot's birthday. Carrot, of course, being the actual name of Kakarot, which was Goku's Saiyan name from Dragon Ball Z. But the connections actually get crazier than that. From that whole chapter 966 thing where Roger does the same thing, that's supposedly the same thing that Luffy says. Well, he mentions that 13 years ago when we arrived at Lodestar. Well, 13 years ago from the date of chapter 966, which came out officially on December 23rd, 2019, 13 years prior to that chapter dropping on December 25th, 2006 is when Ichiro Oda and Akira Toriyama collaborated on the cross-epoch crossover manga. So Ichiro Oda getting to actually draw a manga with his idol, with his manga idol, his dream, is what happened 13 years ago from this moment. Another huge Dragon Ball Z tie-in, and a really good kind of window into the idea of how layered these clues are and how many different dimensions of them apply to the overall story at large. And now that Dragon Ball and One Piece crossover, cross-epoch, has a ton of clues in it, but for this video, the number one clue that's important in it is that it starts off knowing that Mr. Satan has wished to be king of the world. And I think that is a huge clue that Akira Toriyama was in on when they were doing this, that in the One Piece world, someone has taken control of basically a set of Dragon Balls and wished to be king of the world. And essentially the devil is in charge of the One Piece world right now. And I don't want to lose you, but we're going to have to get kind of really crazy into this Dragon Ball clue for a second. When we look through the light, which I've actually got confirmation that this was a utilized technique in the 90s, and Dragon Ball was a big one, kind of hinting at future clues in the story by using light to look through the manga page at the page it's connected to in the back, the side that's naturally connected to when the page is printed out in physical reality, to look for hints to interpret. And when we look through this whole spread of Luffy's dream, do you notice what's in Luffy's mouth there? Now, it's interesting because we all know that Roger made it to Laugh Tale on the Oro Jackson. Well, Oro means mouth. And we know Luffy's treasure is meat, food, things he puts in his mouth and tastes. Well, if you look in Luffy's mouth right there, do you see the 5-star Dragon Ball? And just to stick on that 5-star Dragon Ball for a second, there's a sequel to Dragon Ball before Dragon Ball Super called Dragon Ball GT. And in it, there are these shadow dragons that are made from wishes of the Dragon Balls. And I'm not going to get into it and all this craziness, but the bad guys essentially are embodied forms of the Dragon Balls. And in the episode where the 5-star dragon is featured from the 5-star Dragon Ball, it is an episode where a Rage Shenron uses slime, and it increases the size of his body and it expands around and all this stuff. And I believe that that's kind of happening in one form with Emu's power kind of being spread out through other people's eyes so that she can see things all around the world.
But I said there was more. Not finished yet. There's more. Let me show you this.
I actually think it's a really crazier thing than that, because in this episode, there's a flashback to an episode of Dragon Ball Z, the one where Nappa and Vegeta arrive on Earth. And in the GT episode, Nappa has the wrong colored scouter. And I believe that overall, this is a huge clue, like totally 33rd level, black belt, whatever clue of a wish that reshapes and rewrites canon. And if that sounds too crazy, well then I have to alert you to the fact that this episode of Dragon Ball GT, the 5-Star Dragon, actually aired exactly a month before One Piece premiered in the Shonen Jump magazine. And I got other videos coming out about these huge ties to Dragon Ball that I have in the future, but for this one, I basically think that someone kind of gathered the embodiment of the One Piece world's Dragon Balls and made a wish for the world to make sense. And that in some form, everything that Luffy is doing, all of his actions are kind of culminating in a great story by Oda that makes sense. And like how the copper and pennies was used to clean watering wells and wishing well type things, whatever, I believe that through this great story that makes sense and kind of embodies the world or whatever, it's a way to cleanse the world and make it a better place as a writer. The people that read the story learning, great themes and compassion and empathy and all these things. The hope, I think, from Oda is that this story might change a few hearts in the world. And that's actually what we're going to touch on here, which is what Oda's real version of Luffy's dream is, which is to become the DNA of shonen manga. To usurp the throne of Dragon Ball and become the new lifeblood of every series that has to come after it in the weekly Shonen Jump magazine. That the dream of Oda is that after One Piece is finished, every single author of manga in the world will have to pay homage at the altar of Oda in some way. In the same way that every shonen manga references Dragon Ball, whether it's inherently with the nature of energy and Kai, or if it's quite literal with other things. This idea that authors love the story so much that it naturally becomes ingrained in their writing abilities and the story crafting they have, I think is what Oda's all talking about here, and what his ultimate dream and purpose with his series is. And when we look through the light at actually both Roger's declaration of his hidden dream and Luffy's original declaration with Ace and Sabo, both of them have and backwards in there. Now, and is DNA backwards. Makes sense that and is kind of a joiner of words and phrases and ideas, just like DNA does the same thing on a physical, atomic level in our bodies with genetics and traits and all that stuff. Now, I do also think that there is a lot actually tied to the idea that Luffy might be wishing to be a real boy in some sense here, but that is for future videos too, I'm sorry. Now, while I think every single one of those dream options are valid, and I do actually believe that in reality in this moment, the big kahuna thing is what's being said to ride the biggest wave or whatever, I ultimately do not think that that's what's really important here. To anyone or an entire world that is asleep or stuck in some sort of magical slumber, at the end of a dream, naturally everyone wants to wake up. And I think in a very real way, it's all a reference to enlightenment and waking up the mind and spiritual side and all that stuff of, a human being. But I also just kind of think that overall, it's mainly a clue to the idea that when you've woken up, you've finished your dream, and that, like I said earlier, that each and every single one of the Straw Hats is kind of seeing or feeling some sort of version of their dream accomplished. And in this moment, they're kind of like basically soaking up or kind of drinking Luffy's Kool-Aid and completely buying into the idea that they can actually accomplish whatever their huge dream is. And I said earlier how each member of the Straw Hat crew kind of has their own world-altering dream that's just so big and outrageous that, only someone on the Straw Hat Pirates could accomplish it. In a world maybe powered powered by nightmare fuel and dream and belief power. Luffy's ability here, if it is something like that, is perhaps the most sought after wish granting ability in the world. And I think that that's the true secret to all of this stuff, is that Luffy's dream granting, wish granting powers have been hijacked throughout the One Piece world's history. And I think that that power has kind of been used by other individuals to grant their own kind of evil wishes, to stay in power and in control of the One Piece world. And I could kind of see all of this being funneled into Luffy's mind as some sort of an idea to try to catch the biggest fish, so he has the biggest, greatest, fish catching story, like you would kind of see at an old marine time bar of a bunch of old timers kind of bragging about the good old days of catching the biggest fish, and all stories that are embellished by kind of old people to younger kids at a bar, maybe like Luffy might have experienced in chapter 1, all kind of cluing back into the idea that Luffy does not understand that he's actually the hook designed to catch the biggest dreamers in the world. He thinks he wants to catch a big fish or ride a big wave, but he actually is that big fish or white whale or wave, whatever. The age-old trope of what the hero was searching for all along was always inside of him type thing. In essence, I think that Luffy is a dream detector and a kind of sort of dream magnet, an individual who attracts the biggest dreams and the biggest dreamers. And it is my belief that there are characters all around the One Piece world, especially Shanks, that know this secret power of Luffy's and have been using it to basically gather the Dragon Balls for them. The Dragon Balls in this case being incredibly strong believers with especially juicy imagination and dream powers and beliefs. The members of the Straw Hat crew that Luffy naturally attracts to join him. I think that kind of the main component of this historical continuous reset thing is kind of using Luffy's natural instincts against him, and this ability to attract the biggest dreamers or whatever, whose dream powers combined might be kind of a version of a wish-granting Dragon Ball set. And Shanks has basically been using Luffy to gather this crew, whether he knows it or not. Now, to explain that, because I know that sounds batshit crazy and absolutely the most insane thing you've ever heard. So to explain it, like always, we gotta go back to chapter 1. The very first guy, not counting Gold Roger, that we see die. This mountain bandit dude that's killed by Lucky Roo. If you look at him, you'll start to notice that he's the guy that was talking about the all blue in Sanji's flashback. It's very clear once you notice. Now, it's also really crazy because he's also on page 1 at Roger's execution, the guy with this crossbones tattoo. And if we want to take any magic out of all of this stuff, it is conceivable that this dude could have been in all 3 places before he was actually killed in chapter 1. The invasion of the orbit by Redleg Zeph and all that stuff takes place about a year before chapter 1 officially. So it could be that they were first catching Sanji and then they went and caught Luffy, which I do think is a possibility and most likely in part what was happening. But that guy's death, I think, sets a lot of this stuff off in crazy ways that I'm not going to get into here. But him being part of this dream world, this corrupting dreams into nightmares, I think is what's going on with him. And it's hinted at in this ship that we meet them in. Sanji's original ship that he was working on, the Orbit. The mast of the Orbit, this chicken face thing, this bird head mast, is the same mast that's in the original Romance Dawn one-shots at the end that Ichiro Oda had before One Piece came out. Each one of the one-shots ends with Luffy going to sleep, okay? Now, the one that introduces the black ink, darkness, nightmare outlines around the panels to indicate that it's a flashback, they're introduced in this Romance Dawn thing. And you'll see the mast of the ship is the exact same one as the Orbit. And I believe that that's because in this one, the Golden Dream has been stolen and corrupted, in particularly by Shanks. I think different huge things are going on in all the prototypes. And in this chapter, in this version of Romance Dawn Chapter 0, Shanks is introduced in a flashback, which I've kind of deemed the Nightmare Realm. He's introduced in the Nightmare Realm, and no matter what Luffy's dream is, in the prototype, the Gum Gum fruit is not called a devil fruit. It is simply the Gomu Gomu fruit, and it spawns every 50 years from the Illusion Tree. And every single time in the One Piece manga, I swear to God it's going to blow your mind eventually, Every time the panels and the black panels in the background of the page are filled in black, like signifying that it's a flashback, those are all illusions. They are all sleight of hand tricks by the magician that is Oda. And in this prototype is kind of the first one. No matter what Luffy's dream ever was, because of all the things that Shanks does, especially, kind of, according to Luffy and from his perspective, saving him and in the process losing his right arm. Luffy even says when we meet Sanji in this whole thing, he didn't sacrifice his leg for you to throw away your life and all this stuff. So he believes that there's a life debt owed for saving someone's life, and Luffy is indebted to Shanks. In his mind, since chapter 1, Luffy has been in servitude to Shanks in some form, even if it's just the simple idea of bringing back this hat, which is all crazy, but the goal and job of that has been implanted and imprinted onto Luffy in every single story from this flashback illusion world, and it's basically the key to unlock the devil. This is gonna sound crazy, but I think Oda plays around a ton with Two-Faces and all this stuff, and I believe that when Shanks actually has the straw hat put back onto his head, it may activate like some sort of a magic hat like for Frosty the Snowman and activate and awaken a different beast or personality inside of him. And a huge clue to that is really simply Shirley's prediction. This whole idea that Mary Joa is going to be the end of the Grand Line is going to be destroyed and it's going to destroy Fishman Island. Well, if the One Piece is where it's supposed to be at, they're on the opposite side of the world from Mary Joa. So if finding the One Piece is destroying the Red Line at the reverse mountain point so Laboon can get through, that won't actually affect Fishman Island. Shirley's prediction of Fishman Island being destroyed is by someone in a straw hat, and that was covered in shadows. And I believe that someone in a straw hat is Shanks wearing the straw hat and maybe Buggy's clown nose, basically being a sort of Patch Adams Pennywise fusion that feeds on children's dreams. And in this case, I think the One Piece world's god, so to say, the main character of the One Piece manga, whatever powers that may grant the main character, Luffy, figuratively and literally in the story, that has been corrupted by the devil, so to speak. And that dream that comes with all that stuff of being the main character and protagonist of a shonen manga has been fed on for power in some form by Shanks and others in the One Piece world. And I think this whole kind of dream corruption thing is really highlighted by like this hook drawing style that Ichiro Oda has so many times. And what I mean by that are there are some clues that, I like to fancy myself as a manga artist. I've been middling at my own series for 4 years seriously, but the better part of 15 to 20 years, trying to learn from stories and learn writing from manga and stuff like that. And there are some clues with this stuff that you just won't pick up until you've walked 2 moons in their shoes, so to speak. And trying to replicate and study a specific art style the way that I actually have with Akira Toriyama and Ichiro Oda, you really learn a lot when you look at just the pure lines themselves. And Shanks' whole beard thing is full of hooks. And if you notice, the straw hat itself is as well. And I think, sadly, kind of this idea of hooking them while they're young, like with a lure on a fishing line type deal, is what a lot of things happen in real life, kind of, corrupting children and grooming them, so to speak, I guess, in a very sinister way. I think that is kind of happening by supervillains in some sense in the One Piece manga world as well. And in this first one-shot especially, it's very clearly a shark that bites off Shanks' arm. Now, if Shanks mix up the end, it's a shark, and a shark originally means someone who exploits someone. Someone who exploits another individual. I think all a big clue to hooking in the teeth of his prey, basically, which is Luffy. And I said before there was going to be some harsh truths in this video, and there was just going to be some things you straight up don't like, and this is kind of one of them, because I can tell you right now what Oda's ultimate evil version, corrupted version of this dream is. I talk about this in my For Bink's Sake Wake Up video, but when Oda was a child, there was a contest in the Shonen Jump magazine for the manga Ultimate Muscle, where they asked readers to submit characters of their own design to, if they won this contest, be featured in the manga itself, and each Ichiro Oda sent in Panda Man and ultimately lost. He believed that Panda Man was so cool and was good enough to be a character on the front page of the Shonen Jump magazine. And that dream was crushed because it was, ultimately rejected. And in some form, Oda has taken that and turned it into a revenge tour of basically setting the trap of forcing Shonen Jump's hand of letting Panda Man on the cover of Shonen Jump at some point. And I can tell you how it's done. I have a video called The Poneglyphs Are a Trap, which you should check out for more information on this part of it. But the poneglyphs in one form, we see all this stuff in his hair. You'll just kind of have to take my word for it here. But for some reason, Luffy's hair is a direct clue to the poneglyphs. To be honest, my best kind of guess for this whole thing is that having this whole thing being related to nightmares, his hair would be the mane of a nightmare horse, Neptune controlling horses, Sun Wukong, whatever. But whatever reason, the hair seems to be a clue to the poneglyphs. And in all of these shots with the chained up barrel that is containing caribou inside of it, being in the tips of his hair and stuff like that, I think all that is a clue to when the poneglyphs are gathered, the Animal King is released. And that Animal King is the Panda Man, who is the conductor of the orchestra that starts Ragnarok, or how Oda is going to call it, Pandemonium. And when that happens, it's going to rock the socks off of every single person reading the One Piece chapter that week. And I think after that, his childhood dream will come true, where Panda Man is the main character for a moment in the One Piece manga. And that ultimately means that Panda Man did become the main character of a series in the Shonen Jump, and that's in part what I think the Pirate King is. The logo of the Shonen Jump magazine is this pirate named Journey, actually, and him kind of being the king of the magazine and the runner of the, weekly Shonen Jump magazine, I believe is all kind of a clue to, okay, Oda's going to be the pirate, he's going to be the king of this magazine, and the Pirate King is the best series in that magazine, which is what One Piece is. And I think, of course, also tying into what Oda's real dream might be, which, of course, is to become ingrained in the DNA of manga, become immortal in a sense, in a literary sense, at the very least, and still kind of attain his childhood revenge dream, too. The two sides of the same coin for Oda, the man himself. Relating all of this dream stuff, once that's been acquired by Oda, can finally force the Panda Man play, which is when the poneglyphs are all fully gathered at the end and the story's in its final arc. All of this being the final act. Now, Akira Toriyama, the last name, Tori means bird, Yama can mean climax. So the end of the story, when we go to the Birdman Kingdom, or the Chicken Wing Kingdom, all stemming from that initial broken-hearted child, is what's at play in the One Piece universe at large. And Sanji and this dude in the flashback with the all blue is this dude. But that's just one example of the huge layers of corruption that exist in the One Piece world. I think every single character has a version of that going on with them in some case, and I will be touching on that in future videos coming up in October. Because this truly might be one of the most revealing pages that Oda's ever drawn. And I hope to be doing videos touching on all of them eventually, but if there's one that you want me to touch on before the rest of them, of the Straw Hat Crew and what their corrupted dream might be, let me know in the comments, please. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed and watched this long. My name is Jim Rakai, and I will talk to you all later. Bye-bye.